Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff Mom Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio. And we are so happy to be joined on this tax day by a good friend of the show, excellent coworker, Joey. Welcome, Joey.
Yay. Hey, thanks for having me. Super excited to talk about taxes.
Yes.
That's definitely what this episode
That's what
about.
Everyone loves talking about.
Yes.
Yes. Well, we are talking about a tentpole event, kind of, but not taxes, because as we record this, yes, 420 is coming up. We have done past episodes on some of the issues with 420, if you want to go back and find that. And just like the weed industry in general. And then if you want to hear about the food side of it on Savor, go check that out. But when you suggested this topic, Joey, I immediately knew what you were talking about because you and I both have seen, I think it's the same commercial. I'm not sure though, but
There's
yes.
a lot. There's a lot going around.
Yes. So what are we talking about, Joey?
Yeah. So, surprise, surprise, we're going to talk about weed. I wanted to talk particularly about some of the advertising that we're seeing currently targeted at women selling weed or cannabis products, and some of the conversations that are coming up because of that, and how just kind of an overview of the whole conversation about women and weed and how historically cannabis use has been viewed in women, and now kind of the conversation how that's changing.
I like how y'all are talking about this, and I'm like, I have no idea what either one of you are talking about. I have not been given any of these ads.
Oh my gosh.
If any government officials listening, I have not been a part of this crew.
How dare you?
I'm like, I don't know what y'all talking about.
I would never. Well, and I mean, the conversation of legality and all of that also plays into this, which is interesting. Quick content warning up top. Obviously, like, I'm going to be talking about weed, cannabis. I'm going to keep using the word weed just because that's the word that I use mostly in conversation and with my friends. But of course, yeah, just referring to cannabis generally. In this conversation, of course, I'm going to be mentioning misogyny and racism in the war on drugs historically, and also kind of current weed culture in the weed industry, as well as some mentions of diet culture and its relation to advertising. So just want to put that up top. One more quick disclaimer. Since we're talking about cannabis, I'm not a doctor or a legal expert. So please don't listen to me about any serious issues. Everybody's body reacts differently. Everybody has their own sort of experiences with cannabis. I will be talking about my own experience a little bit, but don't take that as like the, word of the law of how these things, again, everybody processes things differently. Like, I'm a mess. Don't come to me for medical advice or legal advice. Because, yeah, I do, however, I live in a state where weed is decriminalized. Actually, at this point, the only two places I've ever lived, weed is currently legal. So I'm coming at it from that perspective. That being said, of course, like, I'm coming into this with the assumption that, people use drugs, people use weed. I'm not putting any sort of moral value to that. Whether or not is something you want to partake in, that's your choice. Personally, I'm somebody who partakes in that. But yeah. So as we stated kind of at the top, this episode, originally wanted to do this episode because, well, as some of y'all know, about a month ago, I did an episode about the whole conversation about girlhood on TikTok and like all these like girlhood trends and girl insert word and how that kind of spiraled into a lot of different weird stuff. And
yeah,
basically,
I just heard girl rot.
Girl rot.
Like, why is this happening? This is rude.
It is girl rot. I have a lot of thoughts on it. Anyways, we're not going to get on that tangent again. But a big sort of problem I was seeing with that was the way it was making its way into advertising, particularly things like girl dinner and girl math and girl, all those things, how that kind of was being used as like a marketing tool now. I got another really weird targeted ad recently, this time on Hulu. And this sort of set me into a spiral thinking about weed and the conversation about weed and women and all of that. So I made the mistake of not recording this ad or writing down what the company was. I have not been able to find it again, but I will do my best to describe it to you now. Samantha and Anney, I have a question for you, which is that are you familiar with the narrative structure of your average paper towel commercial?
It's my favorite narrative structure.
It's one of the premier exports of American culture, I think. But basically, this sort of commercial usually looks like is there's a white couple. The mom is clearly doing the majority of like the housework. They live in a nice, very clean, unlived in looking suburban household. Usually she's talking about like, my kids are so crazy. They're leaving their stuff all over the place. And my husband doesn't do any work, but I've got XYZ product to help me out. This was basically the same structure of the commercial that I saw for weed gummies, which I thought was really interesting because especially when you look at kind of historically the war on drugs and a lot of the cultural forces that were behind the war on drugs, it's interesting to see this sort of idealized white suburban 2.5 kids, very clear gender roles household being now the face of trying to sell cannabis and trying to sell weed gummies. Something that stood out to me in this particular commercial was there was a bit where she's like, my husband is like, he's a total stoner, but not me. Like, I'm a girl. I don't know how to smoke weed. So, because the whole thing is it's very like, which I'm not going to get into the like taking gummies versus smoking. I think that's a personal choice, but the implication is like, smoking's gross. I need to take these nice health supplement gummies and like frame it in a way that it's like, no, it's healthy and it's good. And it's the whole thing is like, it's helping me calm down from the chaos of my life. And I mean, I would argue, yeah, that is a benefit of weed. And it's something that draws a lot of people to weed is the fact that it is something that calms a lot of people down. It is like a stress reliever. But yeah, the way that this was being framed, it very much was fitting into that traditional, again, 2.5 kids, white suburban, middle class family, paper towel commercial, main character thing.
Yes. And I've seen these. And I am, one of my skills is I am so good at skipping YouTube ads. I know that 15-second mark and I can skip it, but they know that you're gonna skip it. So there was one where like the couple was in bed and they're very like obnoxious couple. They're like over the top and they're in bed and she's like, I just did weed with my dad. And then he like spits out his water. It's like, what? And then 15 seconds skip. So I never saw beyond that part.
It's so fascinating. I think this commercial really like this and these types of commercials that we're both getting, because this wasn't the only one. I've seen variations of this commercial over and over again. I've seen similar things to what you're talking about. I think this really signals kind of a shift in the conversation about weed and the way that weed and cannabis use has been normalized to a certain extent. So basically, like whenever we're talking about this sort of thing, basically since the US became a consumer-centric society, while men are traditionally the ones who are seen to be like making the money and working jobs and creating and selling these products, women are seen as the primary consumers. So I think it is really important to look at how these things are being marketed towards women, particularly to really understand the conversation about something within our sort of capitalistic sphere. So yeah, so this is the latest of that. Some quick background really quick. While medical use of cannabis has been legal in some states across the U.S. since 1996, Colorado became the first state to legalize recreational weed in 2014, so just 10 years ago. Now, 10 years later, recreational marijuana is legal in 24 states. Again, that includes the only two states that I've ever lived in, which are Illinois and New York. Georgia, it seems like it's decriminalized in small amounts and like for some medical uses. I don't know if you guys have anything else, sort of any other info on that.
There's still a big debate with it. There's new laws and bills being passed. There's a lot of headway in trying to get medical access. We just discovered that, yes, you can get, I think, less than 5%, as in like the concentration level for anything, which is, I guess, how it got into the non-alcoholic drink we had, which I was like, what is the world? And it's effective. as hell. But like the overall intent, like they know that it's a big moneymaker for the state. They really are having a hard time in letting that go, other than that, because it is a big moneymaker. They've made tons of money with bills and bonds. There's still people in jail for marijuana in general. Like there's no stopping all of that. So it's really complicated here. It's supposed to decriminalize in that it's not a misdemeanor as opposed to a felony, but that doesn't mean they can't get you, because there's like hashish apparently that has a deeper concentration can still get you 5 years in
Interesting.
jail. So it's complicated.
It's complicated. I think that's the best way to sum it up.
It's complicated. And once again, as I said at the top, like I'm not a lawyer. I'm not about to try to give you a definitive answer. And like this whole conversation in most states has been really complicated and things keep changing. And so much of it is so, I mean, the whole thing is just politics. So it really...
It's racist.
And racist, yeah, it's all, none of it, the real issue is never actually the weed. It's always the underlying thing. So, but yeah, that to say, it is very complicated. I bring up this idea of legalization and the fact that it is fully legal in 24 states to introduce this idea that like this conversation about weed is so different than it was like even 5 years ago. And hence that's, why Anney and I are getting a lot of these advertisements all of a sudden that are framing weed in a way much differently than it had been in the past.
I'm laughing because you're like, yeah, Samantha's already said she didn't get it, so I guess I'll exclude it. Thank you. I'm just not one of the cool kids. It's okay.
That's right.
Just say no, kids. Just say
exactly.
No. I'm a kid of dare.
This is your brain on drugs. So I do want to hear more about the THC infused non-alcoholic liquor you guys had, because that sounded interesting.
It's effective. I got home just in time.
Love it. But to contrast this image, let's talk a little bit about women and the war on drugs. Historically feels like the wrong word to be talking about the 90s, but whatever. I found this article from 1991 in the Berkeley Journal of Gender, Law, and Justice called The War on Drugs, A War on Women. That, again, is from 1991, which was sort of the peak of the war on drugs in full swing, and also around a time when, and this article it talks about drugs very broadly. It's not just talking about weed. It's also talking about like cocaine and a lot of different drug use, all sort of grouped together. But the article speaks about how poor women of color, particularly, were impacted by the war on drugs and some of the unique kind of issues that poor women of color faced during this era. The article states that statistics, quote, indicate that poor women of color do not fall into any categories with the highest incidence of drug use. However, the consequences of addiction to or any association with drugs can be much harsher for poor women of color due to poverty and discrimination. There are a number of factors that lead to the disproportionate impact of the war on drugs on women, including the feminization of poverty, connection to family life, and including specific laws that target drug use in pregnant women. This I found particularly interesting, especially in a time when reproductive rights are under attack once again. On the feminization of poverty and the role of women in the war on drugs, the article states, quote, if they are not involved in the drug trade directly, they are found guilty by association with their children, other family members, friends, and associates. In both the criminal and civil context, the law is used to destroy families and neighborhoods without attempting to address the underlying causes of drug addiction and abuse. The article also, again, points to concerns about pregnancy and motherhood, stating, quote, criminal prosecution for fetal abuse, like all of these other war tactics, is exercised in a racially discriminatory manner. 71% of all women charged with fetal abuse are African American. The most commonly preferred reason for such action is purported concern for the child's welfare, but the sudden concern for the welfare of Black babies prompts suspicion. So the article connects this back to the historic dehumanization of Black women and Black mothers, stating, quote, "This particular strategy in the current war on drugs is a continuation of the dehumanization of Black women that has its roots in slavery. In those times, the slave master controlled reproduction through forced breeding, manipulation of marital choices, and rape. After giving birth, slave women were often denied the right to keep or care for their children. More recently, poor women of color have been subject to forced sterilization, while their ability to choose other means of reproductive control, such as abortion, has been severely limited." And I think this is a really interesting point to start from. And again, like I said, we're living at a time when reproductive health is under attack again. Women are expected to carry children whether they want to or not. And a lot of times the particular scrutiny that is put on women that use drugs like marijuana or any other substance, it has to do with this sort of pseudo concern for the fetus and for the children. And, you know, that already in itself is very complicated and has a lot of messed up connotations. But when you put that into context, the fact that these same sort of social structures that want to keep weed something that's illegal and something that is taboo, these are also oftentimes the same sort of social structures that want to limit women's ability to have any sort of reproductive freedom. So yeah, that's to say, I think all of these issues are connected, and I think any sort of like control over women's bodies or people that can become pregnant over our bodies, that is something that is going to be politicized, is going to be used against us when it can be. And I think that also is interesting to look at in contrast to going back to this idea of the commercial image of people now that are using weed. There's this idea of like the weed mom that's kind of coming out now, that's sort of replacing the idea of like a wine mom. That commercial that I talked about at the top, I think that's kind of a quintessential example of the like, I'm so stressed out because my kids are crazy and my husband doesn't help out with the house at all. Guess I'm going to take some gummies to go unwind, which, you know, I have no problems with that. Motherhood is stressful. I cannot imagine. But yeah, I think there's an interesting character that's being created by these sort of marketing narratives of this usually white, usually more affluent mom who is using weed. And that is something that is just kind of like funny or you know, it's a way to calm down. And that being contrasted with the historic scrutiny on particularly poor women of color and their use of, you know, either weed or any other sort of substance, just because people like to use substances. I mean, again, like all of these things I'm bringing up, well, people are using weed because they're stressed out or because X, Y, Z, but like people have used weed for all of human existence. Like it is kind of one of those things. It's the same with like alcohol. Like, yes, we should talk about the issues, or we should talk about health issues or sociological issues related to it, but it is saying that people are immoral simply for using something is kind of counterproductive. Yeah, so obviously, and again, all of these stigma that existed during the height of the war on drugs, these still exist. They still exist in lots of parts of the country, but so does capitalism. And since weed is now legal in the growing majority of the country, that means that these sort of shame and puritanical values that used to lead the conversation about weed are now being overshadowed by the one force in this country with more power than puritanical values and shame, which is capitalism. And as a result, we're seeing this very rapid brandification of the weed industry. If you walk into a dispensary in any state where it's legal, I'm sure you could see lots of, you know, new, shiny brands of weed, which again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That's, again, just part of American capitalism as it exists right now. But it's definitely very different than I think previously the like purchasing of weed was imagined to look like. And so as cannabis becomes more normalized and more mainstream, I think we're seeing gender become a much more important part of this whole marketing process. So one of the most infamous historical examples of gender marketing is, of course, cigarettes. And I think it's really interesting to look at how the marketing tactics used to sort of feminize smoking nicotine back in the day are now being used to feminize smoking weed or using cannabis. A lot of the times it's more for gummies than it is for actually smoking. And this isn't to say that I think like the cigarette industry is evil. I'm not saying the weed industry is on the same moral footing as the cigarette industry. That's very different. But we're seeing some of the same tactics, which is that in some versions, their products are sort of being marketed in a way that's, quote, like for girls or toned down or sexy. It's made to make you look sexy. And in other cases, it's seen as something that's like empowering or liberating. And through this kind of new marketing of making products that are particularly for women or for girls, we're seeing things like the pink tax come about, which is where in dressing up a product in a way that's like aesthetically pleasing or like girly or pink or whatever, you can charge more for it because it's for girls. So if you don't know what the pink tax is, according to Investopedia, the pink tax is the tendency for goods and services marketed towards women to be more expensive than those targeted at men. And that's why a lot of times, and weed is kind of the more recent version of this, but you see the gender binary sort of imposed on these products that I would argue don't need to be gendered. I don't think there's anything about weed that makes it different for men or women or whatever gender you are to consume it. And yet, again, there is sort of this culture of marketing things in a way towards women that then you're like, okay, and I can charge them a little bit more because we're making it pink and we're making it for girls. And look, this in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing if you want to spend a bit more money on a product because it's like dressed up a little bit. All power to you. I support that. I think the problem is when this is the majority of the conversation or the majority of the products being marketed towards women. Like I will say, I bought a few rose petal joints in my day that are definitely not necessarily for practicality, just because they look nice. But yeah, these sort of marketing techniques particularly start to concern me when they delve into more predatory tactics. And when you talk about things being marketed towards women, a big example of that is diet culture and the way that these products connect to diet culture. So a product that I got advertised the other day was for a THC V product. I'm not a scientist. I could not tell you what those specific things mean. However, the way that they marketed it was the company was called Blaze and Chill, and the product was called Lazy Days, and it's supposed to be weed that doesn't give you munchies. And I feel mixed thoughts on this because on one hand, I get it. Like, munchies can be annoying. And I know plenty of people that are like, I don't want another thing that's going to make me want to eat more. Like, and to each their own with that. That being said, I was like, that seems a little bit weird to be advertising this towards women in particular with, don't worry, it won't make you want to eat more because we know you ladies hate eating food, especially when it's something like weed that's like, I don't know, it's supposed to be something for fun and relaxation. And it can be really fun to eat while you're high, I will say. But yeah, this is the area where I start to get concerned because I think, yes, this gendered marketing sometimes can be a little bit frivolous and can be a little bit fun if you want just like your fun little pink product. But when it gets to the point where we are leaning into these ideas of diet culture and body expectations and all of that, that's when I start to get concerned. And I don't know. That just does not seem like something that's going to end well from my perspective.
Well, interestingly, one of the other, because I saw all of these ads, they had a handful. One of the other big ones was, it was a group of women after like a rowdy night, I must assume, at a book club. And they're all like passed out. And they're like, are you tired of drinking and the hangover? Take your weed gummies. But it also was like, you won't get the calories from the drink. You'll just get the high. Mm-hmm. But going back to that idea of like the wine mom and the weed mom, there was this big concern about like Pass House Bridget did an episode on it about like the rise of drinking to essentially deal with Trump and the patriarchy. And so it became all like the wine mom who is miserable and she's drinking just to like get through the day. And now it's like, well, people are kind of moving away from alcohol. They still want to be thin, but nothing's really gotten better. Take your weed.
right. And this is all to say, I mean, I think the whole conversation about wine moms like that is its own very complicated thing. I think a lot of times, like you said, it's rooted in these real world stress and expectations that we live in a world that is very hostile towards women or to anybody who is not a cis man. And then also, you know, a lot of times motherhood, all of these things, they're very stressful. You're not given a lot of support. We don't live in a culture that lends women or people that are doing this like a lot of support. It makes sense that people are turning to alcohol and then now are turning to weed because these are, again, stress relievers. That's not to say, but then there is, of course, then the concern of, like, when does it become a substance abuse issue? When does it become a thing to numb the pain of the rest of the world and not something that you're just doing for fun? And I'm not getting a ton into substance abuse when it comes to weed in here, just because that I think there is still like a lot of research that needs to be done. And that is a way bigger conversation than I kind of have the capacity to talk about. But yeah, I think these are things to remember as we're seeing cannabis and weed become more normalized and more like mainstreamified. I do think it is also interesting to talking about the way that this whole conversation about how weed is being marketed towards women and these ideas of like girl weed or weed for women kind of companies. I think it's interesting to juxtapose that with the historic and ongoing exploitation of women in cannabis product marketing and advertising, as well as sort of the gender barriers within the actual industry. I found this really fantastic piece from the Denver Post that I will link in the notes called Opinion, Weed Bros Still Cling to a, quote, Booth Babes and No Girls in the Grow Sexist Mentality, written by cannabis journalist Lindsay Bartlett. She writes, objectification of women's bodies is interwoven into the very language of weed, from cultivar names to packaging, over-sexualized marketing, booth babes, and trim bitches. Strain names like MILF, Dirty Girl, and Tits have circulated the adult use marketplace. No matter how well it's grown, it tastes like violence. And I will say, this is usually the kind of thing I'm actually a little bit more skeptical about. Like, I do think sometimes, like, these kind of names sometimes could just be a little bit funny. Like, but I do see where she's coming from. And I think particularly Bartlett is writing as somebody who has worked in the industry and has worked as a woman in the industry and dealt with the misogyny of the industry. I can see how that can be incredibly frustrating, especially when you are contrasting it with the sort of, like she was talking about, the sort of no girls and grow idea that exists in a lot of the grow side of the industry. And so the fact that this is happening and the fact that we're seeing, again, like the prevalence of these more misogynistic names or this mentality, this is happening in tangent with discrimination cases, such as one in 2022 that Bartlett writes about, in which, quote, 2 former employees filed a lawsuit against a Los Angeles-based grow, alleging that the company discriminates against women. One plaintiff was told, quote, it's called Jungle Boys for a reason, and that women were not allowed in the grow. Bartlett also points to a 2021 case in which, quote, a well-known multi-state cannabis brand posted a photo of a woman being used as a table with a rig, hash, and other accoutrements placed on her back to hundreds of thousands of consumers on social media. Had a woman been invited to the marketing table, she might have told them that using this photo was a terrible idea. And that was the one that really made me like, oh, wow, okay, yeah, that sounds like a very misogynistic image. And I think that is something that is important to remember when it's contrasted again with these companies that are presenting themselves as, again, like weed for women or weed for girls. We're going to charge you a little bit more for this. And then the mainstream weed companies are very much leaning into these older misogynistic marketing techniques. like I mentioned earlier, this is very similar to the cigarette industry. Like a century ago, a lot of times cigarettes, when they were marketed towards women, it was about how like it makes you look so like classy and sophisticated, or it's something that's very liberating for you. And then when you see cigarette ads that were aimed at men, they oftentimes, like women, were very much objectified. So yeah, and then if that's not enough to be angry about, I want to bring up one more case from that article that Bartlett wrote, in which he says, quote, in 2024, so this year, a recent lawsuit audaciously claims that social equity regulations in New York, which have attempted to safeguard licenses for minorities, women, and those hit hardest by the war on drugs, are discriminatory against men. Men hold the majority of C-suite roles in weed. And so this really stuck out to me. I also work on Bridget Todd's podcast, There Are No Girls on the Internet, who's often on this show. And this is something that comes up a lot on that show. So ever since the Supreme Court ruling against affirmative action last summer, there have been a wave of lawsuits against programs and measures that have attempted to reverse some of the deep, deep-rooted inequalities in all aspects of the American economy and systems of power. And these lawsuits are concerning for so many reasons. And they also are just like contra to reality. And like in that quote from Bartlett, she states, you know, the majority of C-suite roles in the cannabis industry, as well as every other industry that's being targeted by these sort of lawsuits, are still held by men, and usually white men. So there's this whole sort of panic over this isn't happening in a vacuum. Every sort of moral panic that we're seeing over, again, any kind of small steps to reverse the historic inequality that exists in a lot of our systems. DEI is the big kind of buzzword thing that conservatives are attacking right now. The cannabis industry is just the latest sort of victim of this very, I want to say short-sighted, but it's not really short-sighted because the people doing these lawsuits know exactly what they're doing. But yeah, the cannabis has become the latest victim of that. So I looked a little bit more into this New York lawsuit. So basically, when weed was first legalized in New York, and a similar thing happened in Illinois. I don't know if this happened in other states. I'm sure similar programs were put in place, but the legislation mandated the investment of 40% of all adult use cannabis tax revenue toward rebuilding communities harmed by the war on drugs. That's according to the New York Office of Cannabis Management. And also the law, quote, establishes a goal of awarding 50% of all adult use licenses to distinct SEE, social and economic equity groups, including individuals from a community disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition, a minority-owned business, a woman-owned business, distressed farmers, or service-disabled veterans. And so the case that is currently happening in New York, a pair of white dudes were mad that they had to wait a little bit longer to get a dispensary license. And so now they're suing the state of New York, saying that this policy that tries to prioritize communities that have been more historically impacted by the war on drugs is somehow being racist and misogynistic to them as white men, to groups that have historically faced a lot of discrimination in this country. They are being represented pro bono by the Pacific Legal Foundation, which is a libertarian law firm. Just putting that out there, a lot of these cases seem to be getting pro bono representation by activist law firms. Wonder why that is. And I will say, all of this being said, the New York cannabis rollout, like industry rollout, has been kind of a mess. So I'm not too worried, knock on wood, we'll see. But there actually is another lawsuit ongoing in which 4 women are suing the state of New York for the opposite reason. The way that the licensing system works right now is there's kind of this lottery system that randomizes the queue for cannabis licenses. And the women are claiming that the system doesn't actually do anything to help them kind of gain more, of a priority. There was an article in which they spoke with the lawyer who is representing these women, and they said that they're actually not going to pursue a discrimination case because that would be too complicated. They're sort of more looking at it as hey, this system isn't really working. Can we fix it so that it actually works the way it's supposed to? And also, one more quick tangent about this whole case, and everything going on in New York. According to a Forbes article on the lawsuits and sort of just the overall chaotic state of the weed industry in New York, quote, as the legal retail industry has flagged, unlicensed weed retail spots have exploded with more than 1,500 unlicensed operations compared to just 9 legal venues. So, like, I don't know. There's a lot you can take away from that. I would argue there are, maybe bigger things to figure out than making sure that 2 white men who really, really want to open a dispensary feel like they're being treated fairly. I don't know. Anyways, the whole kind of legal weed industry rollout has been a mess. And I think that also is important to think about when we talk about these kind of issues.
Yeah, I think it's just a quick point to remember that arrests are still happening on the federal level. Like a pretty substantial amount of people who are being arrested for possession. And yeah, that federal level is a big concern. That's been a conversation that's been happening for a minute. And again, it is disproportionately the Black community who was being arrested, which is kind of hilarious that the corporate world / capitalist world are like, yeah, let's jump on it. It's not really going well and people are still getting arrested, but we can still make money. And again, the majority of the shareholders are white men who have been less impacted from beginning. Like we know when we've heard many stories where white men are able to get out of having smoking openly while people from the Black community are literally planted with buds and then arrested for years and years and years and are go into debt because they have no money to do bond and all of that stuff. So it is still important to remember that, this is going one way and we wanted this to be equitable for all peoples, but the fact that people are still being arrested and incarcerated, on top of that, being arrested with multiple charges because they've already had a bad record with weed. And typically a lot of these people it's just weed and can never get back on their feet, meaning they can't get jobs, meaning they're still blacklisted from so many organizations when they just had perhaps a couple of tokes, essentially, like just literally having a couple of ounces. Because even in the state of Georgia, 1 ounce can get you still up to a year or a $10,000 fine, or $5,000 to $10,000 fine is according to who you are and if you have representation and or how the arresting officer feels that day. So it's really just absurd of what this is happening because the discrimination and the discrepancies on how this is looked at is so wide ranging that it's almost like a legend. They tell you as this is like a folklore. Don't go to this area. It's just so absurd.
For sure, it's ridiculous. I mean, and I think that that's such an important point. It is important to remember, it is still criminalized, and a lot of this country is still criminalized on a federal level. And I think again, I opened with talking about the commercials that I'm getting and talking about these sort of marketing techniques we're seeing, because it is such an obvious example of the fact that there's just 2 vastly different worlds that exist in the US. And it is 100% based on who you are, what your identity is, how much money you have. I can come on here and I can joke about, having used weed and talk about this as a sociology, let's talk about these images of women that we're seeing issue. And then at the same time, there's people being arrested for way less and serving serious jail time. There are people that, the reason that all of these legislation, the reason that there's so much emphasis on making sure that these communities that were most impacted by the war on drugs and individuals that were impacted by the war on drugs, making sure that those people can now receive the benefits of the legal cannabis industry and can maybe have a fast pass to getting licensed to sell cannabis recreationally and all of this. It's because the war on drugs ruined lives and ruined communities. And that is something that I think we need to remember, and we need to remember even as, and I think it is ultimately a net positive that weed is being more normalized and that cannabis consumption is seen as something that is just It's like having a beer. It's like going out to a bar. It is just like a normal part of human life. But it's so important to remember, like, that was not that long ago. And that is where we're coming from. And that is still the reality that lots of people in this country face.
Yeah. And just to put a capper on it, our Vice President Kamala Harris there's still people in prison that she put in there for marijuana use.
Yep.
Like that, she has not rectified that situation. Like, I want to, we were so proud when she became vice president, but we can't ignore that a lot of our politicians had big hands in this. Of course, I always argue about the fact that you have to do what you have to do to get to where you are. And for Black women, for the Black community and in general, like, that has to be the game. They toe the line because that's the only way. That was the only way for so many to get to being able to make a difference and make changes, but have to have that conversation of, but are you making those changes? And Wood talks about this because this is a growing, like, we get excited in that this is a growing industry. We are becoming a little more progressive and understanding this, but when it's not in a line that is beneficial to everyone, that's the downfall of this. And it goes with production as well, and who is being marketed, how it's being marketed, and who's able to get to it. And that's that level as well. And like having these types of conversations at a very new industry, this could be a great industry. But yeah, already jumping into pink tax. Come on. Like, it's all these levels.
Right. And on that note, I want to end with a couple more positive, lighter stories regarding weed and women and non-cis men. So first off, a 2022 Harvard-led survey, which looked at patterns of cannabis use in menopausal and postmenopausal women, found that, quote, nearly 79% endorsed it to alleviate menopause-related symptoms. Of those, 67% said cannabis helps with sleep disturbance, while 46% reported it helps improve mood and anxiety. This article from the Harvard Med School website made sure to point out that this research is fairly new and there's lots more that needs to be done to study the long-term effects. Unfortunately, the other side of the criminalization is that it made it very difficult for people to do actual research on cannabis and its health benefits or negative effects, either side of that, for many years. But yeah, so we're kind of starting to see the resurgence of that sort of research again. And yeah, I mean, this is one area in which this could be very helpful for a lot of people that are going through menopause or postmenopausal symptoms. And yeah, like whether we're talking about THC or CBD or whatever, physical and mental relaxation and like the alleviation of pain and stress, these are the things that drive people to want to use cannabis to begin with. And so I think that's good. I think this is important to be looking into, how this tool can be used to help people and to help us sort of deal with, we talked about the whole issue of weed moms using cannabis, but at the same time, like it is something that is a stress reliever, and I think that there is a lot more research that needs to be done to really fully be able to use the benefits of this. Quick personal anecdote on this issue. Personally, and again, back to my disclaimer at the top, just because I'm saying this does not mean this is the same for everybody. Do not take medical advice from me. But weed has been really helpful for me and like navigating gender dysphoria and really like becoming more in tune with my body. I dealt with really bad body dysmorphia for like a very long time. And weed was something that really helped me overcome that and deal with some of the harsher symptoms of having to deal with gender dysphoria and body dysmorphia and all these things that, come about as we live our lives. And I know that I unfortunately, I tried to look into whether there was some like serious research that had been done about gender dysphoria and weed use. There really has not been because, surprise, surprise, two things that have historically sort of been stigmatized have been cannabis and also any sort of gender deviance or gender nonconformity. So there has not been a ton of research, but, from discussions I've had with friends, it does not seem like I'm the only one who's experienced this. And then one more article that was written by that cannabis journalist, Lindsay Bartlett, who wrote the article about sexism in the industry, which I was citing earlier. She also wrote a recent article for Forbes called, quote, "How Indigenous Women Are Revolutionizing the Cannabis Industry." I'm going to link this in the show notes. It's a really awesome article, but totally check it out. But for this article, she spoke to Mary Jane Oatman. Haha, very funny. But I don't know who it is. I had to put that. But she is the COO and executive director of the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Alliance, or ICIA. From the ICIA website, their goals are, quote, "Building an equitable and sustainable Indigenous cannabis industry through sensible policy, education, resources, educational and economic opportunities for our Indigenous entrepreneurs, tribal nations, and our communities, and to provide access to ICIA's network to connect tribal nations, industry partners, advocacy groups, mentors, businesses, and aspiring entrepreneurs." So the article goes into Oatman and how she got involved in cannabis legislation and advocacy. And it says, quote, "Oatman is the fierce advocate she is today because her grandmother went to federal prison for growing in the 1980s, which created a tremendous amount of stigma and shame around cannabis use and cultivation in her family." She goes on to say, "The aftershocks of the war on drugs is still felt, especially by Indigenous elders. It is a regular practice to have drug dogs and targeted search on the reservation," says Oatman. "Her grandmother fears the police to this day. My passion for doing this is because there are so many grandmothers and grandfathers out there like my grandma who live in fear. I don't want anyone to live in fear anymore." And I think that goes back to, Samantha, your point about the fact that this is still something that is federally prosecuted, and Indigenous communities and these Indigenous reservations are oftentimes particularly targets of these sort of searches, the same way that a lot of like marginalized communities within big cities are also targeted by these policies. And so I really loved this article because I really felt like a positive story about how communities that are most impacted by this are now kind of finding some empowerment economically or culturally through the cannabis industry. And then also something that I really loved about this is that the article spotlights not only the organization's activism around cannabis and cannabis decriminalization, but also how it's not just something to be consumed, but it is something that, you know, has a lot of potential as a sustainable material, and has a lot of potential to really have a lot of positive effects in terms of like environmental activism. So Indigenous communities and land are often some of the first to be impacted by climate injustice and catastrophes. And because of that, Oatman really talks about how important it is to look at cannabis as an environmental issue as well. So she's quoted in the article saying, quote, "The future is in industrial fiber. That is a transition needed for the climate change work we have to do. Industrial fiber made with hemp is the gospel. Cannabis can be smoked, yes, but industrial fiber, large-scale manufacturing products, breaking away from the plastic industry, that's where tribes have a huge impact given our land rights." This is also such an important issue to focus on. The whole war on drugs and the criminalization of cannabis, that really stunted a lot of research that could have been done into how hemp can be used as a sustainable material, and particularly how it can be used as a substitute to things like plastic that are historically not very sustainable. So to end with another quote from Oatman from this article, she said, quote, "We need to do this in a way that does not create a capitalistic commodity on the backs of Mother Earth. This is one of those campaigns ICIA is working on, protecting Mother Earth. Growing cannabis is an environmentally conscious way that benefits the next generations. As an organization, we will dig our heels in the sand to make sure it is not a capitalistic approach, but a human and healing approach." And climate justice is so, so important to how we talk about the future. It is like maybe the most important issue as we talk about the future. And it is so tied to capitalism and industry. And I think Oatman's quote and Oatman's sort of perspective on all of this is so refreshing to look at. Hey, like, this is an industry that has so much potential for a lot of good impacts, a lot of good work to be done. it has a lot of potential for us to have a new sort of understanding of the earth and a new relationship with the earth. So let's make sure that we're not just using this as another thing to kind of exploit the earth and do all of the things that capitalism has historically done that have led to the situation that we're in now with climate change and the various environmental disasters that we all kind of just lived through. So yeah, I think she's doing super important work. I hope that the ICIA gets to do more of this work and gets to really, like, these are the kind of stories I really hope that we continue to hear from the growing cannabis industry, and less of the just, this company used a super misogynistic ad, or we're getting girl weed iteration for the millionth time and it cost 20% more because there's a bow on it. But yeah, so I want to stay hopeful. I want to stay positive. And yeah. And then, Anney, as I promised, there was a Star Wars connection. I was going to say my current stash box is a Return of the Jedi lunchbox that I bought when I was like 8 years old.
It feels right. I believe Yoda was he was high as a kite.
If anybody, it was him.
Are you kidding me?
We also know about the holiday special and how fun they had with that.
I do not accept any modern AU of Star Wars where the Millennium Falcon is not just like a weed van.
Yeah. It almost always is. And it's really funny because the lead singer of the Mamas and Papas, a quote came out from her recently where she saw Star Wars and was like, pointed at Harrison Ford and said, "That's my weed dealer."
That's my weed dealer. I remember
so it fits.
Yeah. I feel like there was some Carrie Fisher quote too where she was also like, like, I know that guy.
He was stealing the weed.
Anyways, had to connect it back to Star Wars. This is Sminty. So yeah.
Thank you. I want to see. Send me a picture of this box.
Here. I'll show you on camera now.
Yes. Oh, I love it.
They got it right next to them just in case. And now they've destroyed it.
And
thanks to you,
just
Anney.
knocked it over. But
don't worry. I love it. So good. And I do really like the environmental points at the end because it is Earth Day also. 420.
It is.
Earth Day?
No, it's 420. It's April 22nd, right?
Oh,
because my birthday is the 22nd of a different month, so it was very important to me that Earth Day is also a 22nd.
That's amazing.
I was like, I'm pretty sure your birthday's not going.
No. My birthday's not until the summer, but it is. April 22nd is Earth Day. It's close enough.
I think it's because a lot of companies, like when I was in school, you would celebrate on the Friday. Mm-hmm. And I had a friend whose birthday was April 20th. And he was always like, Earth Day, take my wind out of the sails of my birthday. Anyway, it's close.
It's Green Week,
Don't take Joey's day.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Joey. We always love having you.
Of course.
I believe there will be some more breaking down of TikTok trends.
Oh, yeah. Always. Definitely.
In the future. Well, in the meantime, where can the good listeners find you?
You can find me on Instagram or Twitter at PatNotPratt. That's PATTNOTPRATT. Or you can also hear me occasionally on There Are No Girls on the Internet with Bridget Todd, where we talk about a lot of things that might be interesting to people who listen to this show. So yeah, go check that out.
Always.
Definitely. And past episodes of Sminty.
Oh yeah, that too.
Yes. The coolest.
Oh yeah, that was
on there.
Yeah. Okay, well, yes, thanks again, Joey, for being here. And listeners, if you would like to connect with us, you can. You can email us at stephaniemomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter at momstuffpodcast or on TikTok and Instagram at Stuff I Never Told You. We have a T-Bellic store and we have a book you can get wherever you get your books. Thanks as always to our super producer, Christina, our executive producer, Maya, and contributor, Joey.
Yay, thank you.
Yes. And thanks to you for listening. Stuff I Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.